He was hunting a man worth $1,000, but the sound that cut through the Wyoming winter wasn't from his quarry. It was the sound of something far worse. Gunshots. Not the clean crack of a hunter's rifle, but the messy, chaotic popping of pistols. And worse than the gunshots was the laughter that followed. Jackson Harlow's breath plumed in the frigid air, each cloud a ghost in the twilight. For 5 years he'd been a ghost himself, a bounty hunter haunted by a past he couldn't outrun, no matter how hard he rode. He was 42, with a beard more salt than pepper, and eyes that had seen too much to ever sparkle again. He was tracking a horse thief, a simple job, but the trail had led him back towards the one place he'd been avoiding for years, a derelict trading post on the border, a festering wound on the face of the plains, where the law was a joke and men's souls were sold for cheap. The laughter grew louder as he dismounted, the sound slithering under his skin, making the hairs on his neck stand on end. He tethered his horse, his hand resting on the cold, familiar grip of his Colt revolver. This wasn't his business. His business was a horse thief with a bounty. Get the man, get the money, move on. That was the code that had kept him alive. But some things you can't just ride past. He moved on foot, slipping between dilapidated sheds that leaned on each other like tired old drunks. The flickering torchlight painted the clearing in hellish shades of orange and black. A crowd was gathered. Rough men, trappers and outlaws and drifters, all circled around a makeshift auction block. Jackson's blood ran cold. He'd seen it before, these illegal flesh markets that thrived in the dark corners of the frontier. And that's when he saw her. On the platform, head bowed, wrists raw from rope burns, stood a woman. Her long, dark hair was a curtain hiding her face. Behind her, a small girl, no older than 4, clutched a bundled infant and stood with a defiance that broke Jackson's heart. An auctioneer, a greasy man with tobacco-stained teeth, banged a gavel on a crate. Next lot. A woman, good for cooking or cleaning. Comes with 2 dependents. Quiet stock. We'll start the bidding at $10. A rough voice from the crowd called out, $5. I'll pay 5 just to shut the brats up. Cruel laughter rippled through the men. Jackson's jaw tightened into a knot of granite. He usually minded his own business. Detachment was a tool of his trade. You couldn't hunt men if you let your heart get in the way. But something about the little girl, the way she stood her ground, trembling but unbroken, it made him stop. It made him watch. As if she could feel his eyes on her, the little girl looked up. Her gaze cut through the dim light, through the jeering crowd, and locked directly onto his. There was no plea in her eyes, no fear, just a question, a challenge. And then she did something that stopped the world. She took a tiny step forward, clutching her bundle tighter. Her voice was just a whisper, but it sliced through the biting wind and found him. "Can you buy us, mister?" she asked, her voice impossibly steady. "Please, we won't be trouble." Jackson felt the air leave his lungs. Those eyes. There was something in those eyes that reached back 5 years, into a grave he had dug himself, and clawed at a heart he thought had turned to stone long ago. For a split second, he didn't see a 4-year-old girl. He saw Eleanor, his Eleanor, the warm brown eyes flecked with gold that had been stolen from him by fire and death. $10, another man shouted, pulling Jackson from his trance. The rational part of his brain, the bounty hunter part, screamed at him. Walk away. This isn't your fight. This is how you get killed. But his feet were already moving. He stepped out from the shadows, his voice cutting through the sudden quiet. $15. The auctioneer grinned, his eyes finding the trail-worn stranger in the back. 15 from the newcomer. Do I hear 20? A burly man near the front, a man whose face was a roadmap of bar fights, raised a hand. $20. Jackson didn't hesitate. $25. His own voice sounded alien to him, a stranger speaking with his tongue. The crowd parted, getting a better look at him. They saw the worn coat, the hand resting near his gun, the cold emptiness in his eyes that marked him as a man who had nothing left to lose. They saw the faint tan line on his chest where a lawman's star once rested. They saw a man you didn't cross. $30, the burly man grunted, his confidence wavering. $35, Jackson said. his voice as cold and hard as the frozen ground beneath his boots. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. The auctioneer looked from Jackson to the burly man, who slowly shook his head and stepped back. The gavel cracked. "Sold to the gentleman in the back. Cash only, sir." Jackson walked forward, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. He counted out the worn bills, the transaction feeling surreal, profane. The woman never looked up. The rope was untied from the post and its end was handed to Jackson like a leash. But the little girl, Lily, she walked right to his side, her small hand finding his, her trust absolute and terrifying. Only now up close did he see that the bundle she carried was a sleeping infant, impossibly small, impossibly vulnerable. He led them away from the torchlight, away from the stench of whiskey and cruelty, into the silent falling snow. The woman stumbled behind him, a phantom on a rope. The little girl, however, matched his stride, her tiny boots making prints beside his own. He stopped near a stand of frost-covered pines away from the prying eyes of the camp. He had to know. He had to see the face of the ghost he had just purchased. "Ma'am," he said quietly, turning to the woman. She flinched but didn't look up. "I need to see your face." She hesitated. Her shoulders, visible beneath the thin shawl, were trembling uncontrollably. Then slowly, as if lifting 1,000-pound weight, she raised her head. The fading light of the moon broke through the clouds and caught her features. High cheekbones, a small white scar at the corner of her mouth, and those eyes, brown with flecks of gold, dulled by years of unspeakable suffering. But they were her eyes. They were unmistakably her eyes. Jackson staggered back as if he'd been shot. The world spun, the snow-covered ground tilting beneath his feet. The name was a prayer, a curse, a whisper he hadn't spoken aloud in 5 years. "Eleanor." The woman's eyes widened in a flicker of recognition, so brief he thought he might have imagined it. Then a mask of fear slammed down. She took a step back, pulling the little girl behind her protectively. "My name is Mary," she said, her voice a dry rasp, cracked from disuse. "Mary Wilson. This is Lily. The baby is David." But Jackson wasn't listening. His mind was a maelstrom. It couldn't be. It was impossible. He reached into his coat, his fingers closing around a small, charred piece of fabric. It was all he had left of her, a piece of a handkerchief he'd given her the day before the fire that had taken her, the fire that had burned his world to ash. "You're dead," he whispered, the words meant for himself, for the ghosts that swirled around him. "They told me you burned. They found bones." At the word fire, the woman who called herself Mary flinched violently. Her gaze darted to Lily, a flash of pure terror in her eyes. "You're mistaken, sir," she insisted, her voice trembling. "Please, it's getting colder. The children, they need shelter." Jackson was frozen, caught between a past he couldn't forget and a present he couldn't comprehend. Was this grief finally making him insane? Was he seeing his dead love in the face of every stranger? The bounty hunter in him screamed that this was a trick, a trap. But the man, the broken man who still loved a ghost, saw only her eyes. The baby, David, began to whimper, a thin, hungry sound that cut through Jackson's confusion. The little girl, Lily, shivered beside her mother, her small body shaking with cold. Whatever the truth was, these children were real. Their suffering was real. "We have a long ride," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. He looked at the woman, at Mary, at Eleanor, at the ghost with his lost love's face. "Can you sit a horse?" She nodded, her eyes refusing to meet his. He helped her onto his gelding, then lifted Lily up to sit in front of him before mounting behind them. The woman, Mary, held the infant, her body rigid and tense. Lily, however, leaned back against Jackson's chest without a moment's hesitation, a gesture of trust so profound it felt like a knife in his gut. He hadn't done a single thing to earn it. He wrapped his arms around the small girl, holding the reins, and urged the horse forward. They rode into the deepening night, the snow falling around them like a shroud. Each flake a memory, a question, a ghost. Was he a madman? A fool? Or had he just stumbled upon a miracle in the heart of the Wyoming wasteland? He didn't know. All he knew was that he had just spent $35, a fortune to him, on a woman who wore his dead fiancé's face and two children he knew nothing about. His cabin, a dark silhouette against the snow-swept landscape, was a lonely sight. Smoke still curled from the chimney, a testament to the fire he'd banked that morning, a lifetime ago. For 5 years, this small, rough-hewn box had been his refuge from the world, a place where he could be alone with his grief. Now approaching it with three strangers, it felt both impossibly small and monumentally important. It was no longer a hideout. It was a shelter. He helped Mary down, her movements stiff and uncertain. As he handed her the infant, their eyes met for a fleeting second. In that flicker, he saw it all: fear, desperation, a sliver of hope, and something else: recognition. It was there. He was sure of it. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving him once again grappling with the same maddening question. Who was she? The cabin was sparse: a stone fireplace, a table with two chairs, a single bed in the corner. Wanted posters were tacked to one wall, a gallery of the damned. His rifle hung by the door, always within reach. He stoked the embers, and as the flames leaped to life, casting dancing shadows, he felt the oppressive weight of the silence between them. Mary stood by the door like a cornered animal, while Lily, the little girl, explored the small space with a quiet curiosity that seemed beyond her years. "There's only one bed," Jackson said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. He hadn't made small talk in years. "You and the children can take it. I'll sleep by the fire." Mary simply nodded, settling on the edge of the bed, her body a protective wall around the sleeping baby. Lily climbed up beside her, but her wide, intelligent eyes never left Jackson. She was studying him, dissecting him, with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. He busied himself making a meal, beans and jerky heated over the fire. It wasn't much, but it was warm. He offered a plate to Mary, and she took it with a whispered, "Thank you," her fingers taking care not to touch his. They ate in a silence thick with unspoken questions. He watched her, the way she mashed the beans for Lily, the way she checked the temperature before letting the child take a bite. Motherly instincts, yes, but there was a hyper-vigilance about her, a weariness that went bone deep. She barely touched her own food, her eyes constantly darting towards the door, the window, as if expecting an attack at any moment. After the meal, he heated water for washing and pointed to a wooden trunk near the bed. "There are clean clothes in there," he said, the words feeling foreign. "My sister sent them, for a niece who never visited. They might fit the girl." Mary looked genuinely surprised by this small act of kindness. A flicker of something, maybe gratitude, warmed her haunted eyes for a second. "Thank you," she whispered again. He stepped outside to tend to his horse, giving them privacy, but mostly he just needed air. The night was bitterly cold, the snow now a thick, silent curtain. He stood in the darkness, trying to make sense of it all. 5 years. 5 years since Eleanor Fisher, a schoolteacher with a laugh that could melt snow and eyes that held all the promise in the world, had died in that boarding house fire. They were supposed to be married that spring. He was a deputy marshal then, a man with a future. The fire had burned it all away. They'd told him no one could have survived. They'd found bone fragments. He had buried an empty coffin and his own heart along with it. And now a woman with Eleanor's face was in his cabin. A woman who called herself Mary Wilson and flinched at the mere mention of fire. A woman with a daughter who looked to be about 4 years old. A daughter who would have been conceived right around the time Eleanor disappeared. The math was a sledgehammer to his gut. Was it possible? Or was this just a new, crueler kind of ghost sent to torment him? When he returned, the scene that greeted him was one of quiet domesticity that felt both alien and achingly familiar. David was asleep on the bed, and Lily, wearing a nightgown that swallowed her whole, was drawing on a scrap of paper with a piece of charcoal. Mary had changed into a simple dress from the trunk. With her face washed and her hair combed, the resemblance to Eleanor was no longer just striking. It was perfect. It was terrifying. She looked up when he entered, her gaze meeting his for a second before she quickly looked away, as if the sight of him was physically painful. "You should get some rest," Jackson said, laying his bedroll near the fire. We'll figure things out in the morning. She nodded, lying down beside the children, curling her body around them. Jackson settled onto his bedroll, his back to the fire, facing the door. It was a habit born from years of sleeping with one eye open, always expecting trouble. But tonight, the trouble wasn't outside. It was inside, sleeping in his bed, breathing his air. Sleep wouldn't come. He listened to the soft sounds of the children breathing, the crackle of the fire, and the howl of the wind. He thought of Eleanor's laugh, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. If this woman was Eleanor, why deny it? What could have happened in those 5 years that was so terrible she would erase her own name? And if she wasn't, if this was just some cosmic cruelty, what in God's name was he supposed to do now? Morning came with a reluctant, gray light. Jackson woke instantly, the bounty hunter's internal alarm clock never failing him. Mary was already awake, tending the fire with a practiced ease that suggested years of such duties. David was awake on the bed, gurgling happily, but Lily was still asleep. "You're up early," Jackson said, his voice a low growl. She jumped, startled, spinning to face him. "Force of habit," she replied, her voice clearer than the night before. "I hope I didn't wake you." He shook his head and rose, the tension in the small cabin immediately ratcheting up. The air was thick with everything that had been left unsaid. "Coffee?" she asked. The simple domestic question felt like it was from another life. As the coffee brewed, filling the cabin with its rich, dark aroma, Jackson decided he couldn't wait any longer. He had to know. "Your daughter," he began, his voice carefully neutral. "Lily, she's what, 4?" Mary's hands, which had been folding a blanket, stilled. "Nearly 5, she answered, her eyes fixed on the sleeping child. "Born in 82 then," Jackson stated, more than asked. She nodded, still not looking at him. The numbers clicked into place in his mind, each one a hammer blow. "The fire at the Willow Creek boarding house was in January of 81, he pressed on, his own heart pounding against his ribs. "Eleanor Fisher was declared dead on January 18th, 1881. Mary flinched at the name, a visible, undeniable reaction. Her shoulders went rigid. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Harlow." "Are you?" The question hung between them, sharp as a razor. "Because you have her eyes, Mary. You have Eleanor's eyes. You have her voice. You even have the small scar at the corner of her mouth from when she fell off a horse as a girl." She turned away from him, busying herself with straightening things that didn't need straightening. "Many people share similar features," she said, her voice tight. "It's a coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidences," Jackson said, his voice dropping low. "Not like this." Before she could answer, Lily stirred. The little girl sat up, rubbed her eyes, and patted across the floor to her mother. The confrontation was over for now. As Mary soothed her daughter, her voice softening, her entire posture changing, Jackson watched, a storm of confusion and suspicion raging inside him. Then Lily, this tiny, serious child, turned her impossibly old eyes on him. "Do you have any books?" she asked. The question was so unexpected it threw him completely off balance. "A few," he admitted, gesturing to the small shelf above his bed. "Nothing for children." "That's all right," Lily said, with the gravity of a seasoned scholar. "I can read grown-up books. Mama taught me." As they ate a meager breakfast of cornmeal mush, Jackson watched the little girl. He watched the way she meticulously folded the corner of her napkin, the way she hummed a little tune between bites. Eleanor had done that. She had folded her napkins exactly the same way. Every small gesture was a fresh stab of memory, a new piece of a puzzle he couldn't solve. After they ate, Lily wandered over to the bookshelf. She pulled out a worn, dog-eared volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, a book Jackson had carried with him for years, a relic from a more civilized time in his life. She opened it, and in her clear, childish voice began to read aloud, sounding out the words with painstaking care. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." Jackson froze. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Those words. That was Eleanor's favorite sonnet, the one she had recited to him under a full moon, the night he asked her to be his wife. "Where did you learn that?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he'd intended. Lily looked up, startled by his tone. Mama reads it to me sometimes, she said, her eyes wide, when I can't sleep. Jackson's gaze snapped to Mary. She stood with her back to them, her body as rigid as a statue. Does she now? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. This was no coincidence. It was a message, a clue, or a trap. He didn't know which, and that was the most terrifying part of all. He had to get to the bottom of it. He had to know who this woman was and what she wanted from him. The day crawled by in a state of surreal tension. Jackson busied himself with chores, splitting wood, checking traps, anything to keep his hands and mind occupied. Mary kept to herself, tending to the children, her silence a wall he couldn't seem to breach. But he felt her eyes on him when she thought he wasn't looking. He was being watched, evaluated. Late in the afternoon, as the snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, Jackson saw a lone rider approaching through the swirling white. Someone's coming, he said, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. Mary's reaction was immediate and visceral. She snatched Lily, her face paling, her eyes wide with a terror that was chillingly real. Who is it? She breathed, her voice tight with panic. Jackson squinted through the frosted pane of glass. Sheriff Calloway, he said, recognizing the man's familiar shape. He's one of the few honest lawmen left in this territory. No cause for alarm. But Mary wasn't reassured. She backed away into the darkest corner of the cabin, clutching the children like a shield. The fear rolling off her was so potent, Jackson could almost taste it. This wasn't an act. This woman was terrified of the law. Sheriff Calloway stamped the snow from his boots on the porch before entering, a gust of frigid air following him in. He was a tall, weathered man whose face looked like a poorly drawn map of a hard life. He nodded at Jackson, his gaze quickly landing on the woman and children huddled in the corner. Didn't know you had company, Harlow, he said, his eyes lingering on Mary for a beat too long. What brings you out in this weather, Sheriff? Jackson asked, keeping his tone casual, though his instincts were screaming. Calloway accepted a cup of coffee, warming his hands around the tin mug. Trouble, he said simply. Thought you should know. Marcus Blackwood's in town. The name landed in the room like a physical blow. Jackson felt Mary stiffen, a tiny choke sound escaping her lips. Marcus Blackwood. The name was poison in this part of the country. A wealthy, powerful man from Denver who ran a vast criminal empire of smuggling, extortion, and worse. A man who operated above the law because he owned most of it. I thought Blackwood stayed in the city, Jackson said, keeping his eyes on Calloway. Normally, the sheriff agreed, but he's looking for something, or rather, someone. Some stolen property that disappeared from his estate last week. A woman and 2 children. The air in the cabin became thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. Calloway's eyes flickered to Mary again, a silent, knowing look that made Jackson's blood run cold. Was this a warning or an interrogation? I'm not asking questions, Harlow, the sheriff said as if reading his mind. Just thought you should be aware. He's offering a substantial reward, and you know how many men in these parts would sell their own mother for a handful of silver. He finished his coffee and stood to leave. At the door, he paused. Whatever you've gotten yourself into, be careful. Blackwood's not a man who likes to lose. The moment the door closed, the silence in the cabin was deafening. Jackson turned to Mary. She was pale as a ghost, trembling so hard he thought she might shatter. You want to tell me what that was about? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. We have to leave, she whispered, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped bird. He'll find us here. He'll find us. Who will? Blackwood? Jackson stepped closer, trying to keep his voice calm for the sake of the children. Was he the one who had you at that auction? She shook her head frantically. Not him. His men. After Mr. Wilson died. They said we were a debt to be collected. We can't go anywhere in this storm, Jackson said, his voice firm. We'd freeze before we got a mile. Then we'll die free, she said, a sudden, fierce fire igniting in her eyes. It was the first spark of the woman he remembered. Better to die in the snow than to go back to that place. You don't know what he's capable of. The raw terror in her voice, the sheer desperation, it told him everything he needed to know. Whoever this woman was, Eleanor or not, her fear of Marcus Blackwood was the most real thing he had ever seen. He had a choice. He could turn her out, wash his hands of it all, and go back to his empty, haunted life. Or he could stand and fight. "No one is dying," he said, the words coming out before he had even consciously decided. "And no one is taking you or these children anywhere. Not while I'm still breathing." The promise hung in the air, a vow made to a ghost, a stranger, and two children who might not even be his. Or were they? The thoughts slammed into him again. If this was Eleanor, and if she'd been pregnant when she disappeared. Lily, could Lily be his? The possibility was a dizzying, terrifying chasm opening up at his feet. "We stay here until the storm breaks," he said, taking command of the situation, of himself. "And then, Mary, or whoever you really are, you're going to tell me the truth. All of it." She looked at him, a long, searching look. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Desperation, calculation, and finally resignation. "After the children are asleep," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I'll tell you what I can." As night fell and the storm raged outside, they fell into a strange, unspoken truce. They ate, they washed the dishes. Lily, seemingly sensing the gravity of the moment, asked for a story, and Mary, in a gesture that stunned him, looked to Jackson. "Perhaps Mr. Harlow would read to you tonight," she suggested, a peace offering. He found an old book of frontier tales and sat awkwardly on the edge of the bed. He began to read, his deep voice filling the small cabin. Lily listened, her eyes wide until sleep finally claimed her. As she drifted off, her small hand reached out and rested on his arm, an act of simple, innocent trust that felt like a brand on his soul. How long had it been since anyone had touched him with anything but violence or greed? After the children were sound asleep, Mary moved to the small table by the fire and gestured for him to join her. The flames cast flickering shadows across her face, making her look both old and young, a stranger and the only woman he had ever loved. "My name isn't Mary Wilson," she said, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear. Jackson's throat felt tight. "Then who are you?" She finally turned and looked at him, her eyes, those impossible eyes, reflecting the firelight. "I think you already know," she whispered. "Say it," he breathed. "I need to hear you say it." A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She brushed it away with a trembling hand. "My name," she whispered, the words seeming to cause her physical pain, "is Eleanor Fisher." The world stopped spinning. For 5 years he had been a man walking through a graveyard, and now a ghost had just spoken his name. The grief, the rage, the soul-crushing emptiness of half a decade. It all came crashing down on him in that one impossible moment. "How?" The word was all he could manage. It was a gasp, a prayer, a demand. She began to speak, her voice a monotone, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "The fire, it wasn't an accident, Jackson. It was set to cover my disappearance." "Blackwood," he breathed, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. She nodded. "I was a secretary for Judge Patterson before I saw things, documents, ledgers, proof that Blackwood was buying judges, smuggling goods, even people. I made copies. I hid them. I thought they were my insurance." Her voice broke, but somehow he found out. "Why didn't you come to me?" Jackson's own voice was raw with anguish. "I was a deputy. I could have protected you." "They threatened you," she said simply, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "They said if I went to the law, if I told you, they would kill you. They said they would make it slow and painful, and I believed them." He felt sick. The fire, the fake funeral, the years of mourning a lie, it had all been a game to Blackwood. "So they took you," he prompted, needing to know the rest, no matter how much it hurt. Her gaze drifted to the sleeping children. "They took me to Blackwood's estate near Denver. He likes to break people, especially people who have spirit. It's a game to him." Jackson's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. Did he touch you?" The question was acid in his throat. "No," she said quickly, cutting him off. "That wasn't his way. He preferred to watch, to orchestrate things." She took a deep, shuddering breath. I was already pregnant when they took me, Jackson. The words hit him like a physical blow. He looked from her to the sleeping form of the little girl on the bed. Lily, my child, he whispered. Eleanor nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. Our child. I was so afraid they would take her from me. But Blackwood, he had a crueler idea. He said watching me raise your daughter in his prison was a more fitting punishment. For you. Jackson felt a rage so pure, so hot it threatened to consume him. This wasn't just about a stolen life. This was about a stolen family. A daughter he never knew he had. 5 years of her life, gone forever. And David? He asked, his voice barely audible. When Lily was 3, she continued, her voice flat and dead, Blackwood forced me to marry one of his men, a cruel man named Wilson. David. David is his son. She choked on the words. Wilson died 6 months ago. A fall from a horse. After that, Blackwood decided we weren't worth the trouble anymore. He sold us to settle Wilson's gambling debts. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it all was staggering. Jackson shot to his feet, pacing the small cabin like a caged wolf, the storm inside him more violent than the one raging outside. Why didn't you tell me last night, he demanded, turning on her. Why pretend to be Mary? Habit, she cried, her composure finally breaking. Survival. For 5 years, Eleanor Fisher was a ghost. I didn't know if you'd believe me. And even if you did, she hesitated, her voice dropping to a broken whisper. I didn't know if you'd still want me. Not like this. Broken. With another man's child. Her vulnerability, her fear that he would reject her after everything she had survived, it shattered the last of his anger. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her, taking her small, calloused hands in his. Eleanor, he said, his voice thick with 5 years of unshed tears. I never stopped looking. For months, I tore that town apart. I dug through the ashes with my bare hands. When I finally accepted you were dead, a part of me died too. I'm sorry, she sobbed. Jackson, I am so sorry. Don't, he said fiercely, his grip tightening on her hands. Don't you ever apologize for surviving? Don't you ever apologize for protecting our daughter? He said the words, our daughter, and they felt both sacred and strange on his tongue. He looked from Eleanor's tear-streaked face to the bed where Lily slept. His daughter, a miracle he hadn't known he was praying for. What happens now? Eleanor asked, her voice small, the question holding the weight of all their lost years, of a future they had both given up on. Jackson looked at the sleeping children, then back at the woman he had mourned, the woman he had just brought back from the brink of hell. A new feeling was stirring in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. It wasn't just grief or rage. It was purpose. Now, he said, his voice a low, determined growl that promised retribution. Now we fight. The storm outside howled, piling snow against the walls. But inside the small cabin, something had shifted. A ghost had come back to life. A broken man had found a reason to live, and a reckoning was coming for Marcus Blackwood. Dawn broke with an eerie quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried under a thick blanket of white. Jackson hadn't slept. He had spent the night watching over them, watching Eleanor and the 2 children, his mind reeling. Eleanor was alive. He had a daughter, a beautiful, brave little girl named Lily. The reality of it was a fragile, terrifying thing. He was afraid that if he closed his eyes, he would wake up and find it was all a dream, that he was still the same empty man in the same empty cabin. But as the pale morning light filled the room, they were still there. Eleanor was stirring, and Lily, his daughter, sat up and looked right at him. She didn't seem surprised to find him watching her. She just gave him a small, solemn nod, as if they were old comrades. She slipped out of bed and padded over to him, her oversized nightgown trailing on the floor. You know, don't you? She asked, her voice a soft whisper. Jackson was confused. Know what, sweetheart? That Mama's name is Eleanor, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And that you're my real father. Jackson's breath caught in his throat. How could she know? She has a picture of you, Lily continued, her voice dropping even lower. She keeps it in a little tin box. Sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep, she takes it out and cries. The image of Eleanor, alone in the dark, crying over a photograph of a man she thought she'd never see again, it was a knife in his heart. Yes, he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. I know. Lily looked him up and down, a serious, appraising look. I thought so, she said, satisfied. I have your eyes. Then she turned her head, pushing her tangled hair away from her ear to reveal a tiny crescent-shaped birthmark. And I have this too. Jackson's own hand flew to the back of his neck, to the identical mark he'd had since birth. He reached out, his rough, calloused finger gently tracing the mark on his daughter's skin. It was real. She was real. She was his. A real, genuine smile finally broke through Lily's solemn expression. And then she did something that broke him and healed him all at once. She stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around his waist, hugging him tight. He froze for a second, a man unused to tenderness, to touch that wasn't violent. Then he folded his own arms around her, holding his daughter for the very first time. He buried his face in her hair, and for the first time in 5 years, Jackson Harlow felt something other than loss. He felt home. A soft sound made him look up. Eleanor was standing by the bed, David in her arms, tears streaming silently down her face. She was watching them, a look of profound joy and sorrow warring on her features. The family that should have been, stolen from them, now reunited in this tiny snowbound cabin. The moment was perfect, fragile, and utterly terrifying. Because out there, beyond the silent white landscape, a monster was hunting for them. And Jackson knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Blackwood would not stop until he had dragged them all back into the darkness. The next few days were a blur of impossible domesticity. It was like playing house in the middle of a war zone. Jackson taught Lily how to track rabbits in the snow. Eleanor cooked meals that made the small cabin feel like a home. They moved around each other cautiously at first, two strangers who knew each other's souls. They were learning to be a family, one stolen moment at a time. But under the surface of every meal, every shared smile, the threat of Blackwood loomed. They were living on borrowed time. On the fourth morning, the snow had melted enough for travel. It was time. He'll be expanding his cert, Jackson said, staring out the window. We can't stay here. Eleanor nodded, her face set with a grim determination that was a world away from the frightened woman at the auction. What's the plan? Jackson spread a map on the table. Blackwood will expect us to run for the border, so we're not going to. We're going to do the one thing he'd never expect. We're going back. He pointed to a small dot on the map. Willow Creek. You said you hid the evidence there. Eleanor's eyes widened. Jackson, his men will be all over that town. They'll be watching the roads into town, he countered. They won't be expecting someone to come out of the wilderness, and you're the only one who knows where the evidence is hidden. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. But we can't take the children. It's too dangerous. The fear returned to her eyes, the primal terror of a mother being asked to leave her cubs. No, I can't. I won't be separated from them again. Just for a few days, he said gently. I know someone. An old widow named Maggie Abernathy. Her farm is remote, defensible, and she hates Blackwood more than anyone I know. He took her daughter years ago. The children will be safe with her, safer than they are with us. The argument was brutal, but logical. Eleanor looked at Lily, who was watching them with her unnervingly perceptive eyes, and her resolve hardened. All right, she agreed, her voice tight. But we do this together, you and me. Leaving the children was the hardest thing Jackson had ever done. Lily hugged him tight. Bring Mama home safe, she commanded, her small voice filled with the weight of an adult's plea. Promise. I promise, Leaflower, he whispered, the vow searing itself onto his soul. They rode for 2 days, using old miners' trails, sleeping under the stars, moving like ghosts through the rugged country. They talked. Eleanor told him more about her captivity, about the quiet acts of defiance that had kept her spirit from breaking. He told her about the empty years, the bounties that had blurred into one long, meaningless chase. They were rediscovering each other, piece by broken piece. The love was still there, buried under years of pain and trauma. But it was there, a stubborn ember that refused to die. Willow Creek was a ghost town of memories for both of them. It was where they had fallen in love and where their world had ended. Now it was their only hope. Under the cover of dusk, they slipped into the town. Blackwood's men were everywhere, their presence a suffocating poison. "The evidence is under the old oak," Eleanor whispered, her voice tense. "The one in the town square." Jackson's heart clenched. The oak tree where he had proposed to her. Of course, it was a place only they would understand. "I'll create a distraction," he said. "You get the box. Meet me at the creek." He set a few horses loose from the livery, and the town erupted into chaos. In the confusion, he saw Eleanor dart to the tree, her hands digging frantically at the base of the trunk. She pulled out a small metal box, tucked it into her jacket, and melted back into the shadows. It was working. They were going to make it. But then a shout rang out. "Hey, you!" One of Blackwood's men had spotted him. The game was up. "Run, Eleanor!" Jackson yelled, drawing his revolver and firing into the air. He ran, dodging between buildings, bullets whining past his head. He plunged into the icy creek, scrambling up the far bank as more of Blackwood's men joined the chase. He made it to the woods to the rendezvous point, his heart hammering with fear. Where was she? And then he saw her, a shadow detaching itself from the trees, the horses already saddled and ready. Relief washed over him in a dizzying wave. "You have it?" he gasped. She patted her jacket. "Let's go." They rode like the devil himself was on their heels. The small metal box was a lead weight in Eleanor's jacket, both their damnation and their salvation. Inside was everything. Ledgers, names, dates, proof of Blackwood's entire depraved enterprise. It was enough to burn him and his empire to the ground. At dawn, they saw riders on the trail behind them, a lot of them, and leading the pack, a large man on a black horse. Blackwood himself. He must have been in town. He was coming for them personally. "He knows," Eleanor said, her face pale. "He knows we have it." They pushed their horses higher into the mountains, into treacherous, rocky terrain where a pursuit would be harder. The air grew thin and cold. Their horses were failing, their own bodies screaming with exhaustion. They found a small, abandoned miner's shack, a tiny alcove in the rock face, and decided to make a stand. There was nowhere left to run. As night fell, they could see the campfires of their pursuers in the valley below. They were surrounded. "He'll wait for morning," Jackson whispered, checking his rifle for what felt like the 100th time. "He'll attack at first light." "So we don't wait," Eleanor said, her voice steely. "We go now, under the cover of darkness." It was a desperate, insane plan, but it was the only one they had. They led their horses on foot, moving silently through the rocks. They were almost clear when one of the horses stepped on a loose rock, sending a shower of stones clattering down the mountainside. The night exploded with gunfire and shouts. "There they are! Get them!" They leaped into their saddles, spurring their horses down the far side of the mountain. A bullet screamed past Jackson's ear. Another tore a chunk out of his saddle. They were gaining. He could see them now, dark shapes closing in fast. "There's a fork in the trail ahead," Jackson yelled over the thunder of hooves. "You go left. Get the evidence to Denver. I'll hold them off." "No!" Eleanor screamed back. "Not again! I won't leave you!" "Go!" he roared, reining his horse to a stop behind a massive boulder. He leaped off, slapping the horse's flank to send it after her. "I promised Lily I'd get you home safe. Now go!" He watched her disappear down the trail, a lone, desperate figure carrying the hope of their future. Then he turned, raised his rifle, and prepared to meet his past. Marcus Blackwood and his men rounded the bend, their faces grim in the pre-dawn light. "Harlow," Blackwood called, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "It's over. Give me the woman in the box, and I might let you live." "She's long gone, Blackwood," Jackson lied, his voice steady. "And she has friends waiting for her, federal marshals." Blackwood laughed, a cold, empty sound. "You always were a fool, Harlow. There are no marshals. There's just you and me." He gave a signal, and his men began to spread out, flanking Jackson's position. Jackson knew he was going to die, but he also knew that every second he held them here, every bullet he made them waste, was another second Eleanor had to get away. He thought of Lily. He thought of Eleanor's smile. He wasn't just a bounty hunter anymore. He was a father. He was a husband, in all the ways that mattered. He had something to die for. He took a deep breath, aimed his rifle at the man who had stolen his life, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon, the opening salvo in a battle that would determine everything. He fought like a cornered animal, with a ferocity that stunned Blackwood's men. He was a ghost, a phantom, moving from rock to rock, his shots precise and deadly. He took down one man, then another. But there were too many. A bullet grazed his arm, a hot, searing pain. Another ripped through his leg and he went down. They closed in, their boots crunching on the gravel. Blackwood stood over him, a triumphant sneer on his face. "I told you it was over, Harlow." He raised his pistol, aiming it at Jackson's head. Jackson closed his eyes, a single, clear image of Eleanor's face in his mind. "I kept my promise, Leaflower." But the shot never came. Instead, another sound echoed through the canyon, a single clean rifle shot from high on the ridge above. Blackwood's eyes went wide with surprise. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his forehead. He staggered back, his pistol falling from his lifeless hand, and collapsed in a heap on the ground. Jackson stared, bewildered, as Blackwood's men looked around in panic. And then he saw her. On the ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun, was Eleanor. She wasn't fleeing. She hadn't run. She had circled back. She had climbed the ridge, and with a stolen rifle and a steady hand, she had ended it. She had saved him. From the other end of the canyon, more riders appeared. Sheriff Calloway, and behind him, a posse of grim-faced men wearing the stars of federal marshals. Jackson's lie had become the truth. Eleanor scrambled down the ridge, her face a mask of terror and relief. She knelt beside him, her hands frantically trying to stop the bleeding. "You idiot," she sobbed, tears mixing with the dirt on her face. "You magnificent, stubborn idiot. I told you I wasn't leaving you again." He looked up at her, at the woman who had walked through hell and come back, at the woman who had just saved his life. "Looks like we saved each other," he managed to choke out, a bloody grin spreading across his face. She leaned down and kissed him, a desperate, fierce kiss that tasted of gunpowder and tears and 5 years of stolen time. "That's what families do," she whispered. "They save each other." He was in a hospital bed in Denver. For a week, he drifted in and out of consciousness, the world a blurry haze of pain and hushed voices. But every time he opened his eyes, she was there. Eleanor. She never left his side. And sometimes he would wake to the sound of a small, clear voice reading him stories of brave explorers in faraway lands. Lily. When he was finally strong enough, they brought the children to see him. Lily rushed to his bedside, her face alight with a joy that was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She pressed a small, crudely carved wooden horse into his hand. "To remind you of how brave you were," she said. Eleanor stood behind her, holding David, and smiling a real, genuine smile that reached all the way to her golden-flecked eyes. She looked at him, and he saw not the ghost of his past, but the promise of his future. A future he had thought was buried and burned to ash. The road to recovery was long. Blackwood's empire was dismantled, his corrupt officials brought to justice. The stolen women were freed. Mrs. Abernathy was even reunited with her daughter Catherine, who had been found alive at one of Blackwood's remote estates. Justice, it turned out, was not a myth. It was just slow. One sunny afternoon, months later, Jackson, now walking with a cane and a permanent limp, stood with Eleanor on a small plot of land they had bought just outside of Denver. They watched as Lily chased butterflies in a field of wildflowers, her laughter carrying on the breeze. David, now a toddler, took clumsy steps towards his mother. "I never thought I'd see this," Eleanor said softly, her hand finding his. "A normal day. A peaceful day." "We earned it," Jackson said, his voice rough with emotion. He looked at his family, this impossible, beautiful family forged in the fires of hell. They were all scarred. They were all survivors. But they were together. They were whole. He was no longer a bounty hunter. He was no longer a ghost. He was Jackson Harlow, a father, a husband, a man who had been given a second chance at life, and he wasn't going to waste a single second of it. He pulled Eleanor close, and as he kissed her, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was finally home. If you were gripped by this story of survival, revenge, and a love that refused to die, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming up next. And let me know in the comments below, what would you have done if you were in Jackson's boots at that auction? I can't wait to hear from you. Until next time, stay safe out there.